Hello there, my name is Liz Ferguson and I'll be talking to you today about marine ecosystems. As previously mentioned, there are quite a few marine ecosystems that we find. We can take the ocean and break it into quite a few different types of habitats. So today we'll be taking a deeper, closer look at some of these habitats. So first off, it's important to note that ecosystems can be influenced and thus have various and differing characteristics due to several different influences. There are some common processes such as tectonics or interactions with the plates that kind of create our Earth's crust, as well as exposure to waves, winds, and ocean currents that can have an impact on all of these different habitats or ecosystems. And independently, they can have influences due to tidal range and the intensity of a current, the supply of sediment and transport along a coast, as well as a coastal climate. So typically we can take the ocean and divide it into two different categories, two broad categories. That consists of benthic zones, which are niches that are found along the seafloor. And these niches don't have to be necessarily deep, they just have to have some kind of interaction and be focused on that seafloor. It can consist of shallower regions. And then pelagic zones, which are going to be layers within that water column. And we've briefly touched on this and we'll go into it a little in a previous presentation, and we'll be digging into that a little bit deeper today. So within benthic zones, or I guess across benthic zones, we have several subcategories. First, we start off with the shallower and eventually reach the deeper of those benthic zones. The shallowest is the intertidal zone, which is an area between the high and the low tide line. So this is where the sea and the land kind of merge and meet. This is going to be a highly variable and highly dynamic region, and the occupants or the organisms that exist there are going to have some specialization in terms of being able to survive periods of time where they are exposed without the water surrounding them, as well as where they are submerged in the water. So it requires a robust organism that can handle those two very different environments. We then next step to the sublittoral zone, which is always going to be underwater. This is found on the continental shelf, so it's going to be a shallow region, typically a few hundred meters at most, and it tends to be quite a bit of diversity in benthic life within this region. Next, we have the bathyal zone, which is going to be along the continental slope. So that occurs from approximately 200 meters or so down to 2,000 meters. There's very little, and after about 400, 500 meters or so, there's no sunlight, or maybe it's a little bit deeper, maybe it's about 800 meters. There becomes no sunlight available. And it's going to be an area of cold and high pressure. Next, we have the abyssal and the hadal zones. The abyssal plain is either a flat or a gentle slope that occurs between 2,000 and 6,000 meters on the abyssal plain. It's going to consist of a bottom that has a very hard rock that is covered in fine-grained sediment. The animals within this region are going to eat anything, so they'll consist of anglerfish and deep-sea jellyfish, and they basically will be omnivores. Anything that's available, they will consume. Within the hadal region, which is the deepest benthic regions of the ocean and greater than 6,000 meters, this region is going to be less common. I mean, there's not going to be as much space that has this hadal kind of categorization to it, as it's going to consist of trenches that are narrow depressions in the ocean floor walls and the bottom of trenches. So for instance, the Mariana Trench, which is about a little over just under, I should say, 11,000 meters deep, is going to be a very, very narrow range or a very narrow area, but something that we consider hadal. So there's not a ton of these deep kind of trenches that are found within the seafloor, but they do exist intermittently across the seafloor. Organisms living there consist of amphipods, isopods, fish, polychaetes, and snailfish. So cute. So in the pelagic zone, as I mentioned, we can break that into different regions as well, and they're just basically sections of that water column. Within the top region, within the pelagic zone that's close to the shore, we refer to that as the neritic zone, as it's going to occur in parallel to the continental shelf. And just beyond that neritic zone, we have the oceanic pelagic zone. So that's going to consist of what regions of water that are going to occur above the continental slope and are then going to be further divided into 5 areas based on depth. And that consists of the epipelagic zone, the mesopelagic zone, and the bathopelagic zone. It's important to remember that when you're thinking about, and I've mentioned this before, but when you're thinking about these kind of slices of the ocean here, despite the fact that we think of it as just one big ocean, there's going to be resources that are available in each of these different portions of the ocean that are going to dictate what kind of organisms are able to live in it. So at the very surface, you'll find mostly air-breathing animals as well as organisms that require sunlight in order to consume energy, obtain some energy, and turn that into ATP. Just below that is the twilight or dysphotic zone, which is where the sunlight decreases quite rapidly with depth. And I'd say by about 800, 900 meters or so, that light is gone. It also is important to note that despite the fact that there is some light that goes down there, it's going to be insufficient for organisms to conduct photosynthesis. And then below 1,000 meters, we have something called the midnight or the aphotic zone, where there is no sunlight at all. This tends to have different temperatures. As we've mentioned in previous talks, the temperature and salinity profiles will change in that water column as well, and that will influence the organisms and characteristics of these different zones. We can, despite the fact that we have some great terminology there, we also can phrase these in a different way. There's different nomenclature you can use to describe these different zones. The epipelagic zone is going to be in region of 0 to 200 meters, where the euphotic zone is, right? And that's going to consist of a sunlit region that has warm water. The mesopelagic zone will be up to 2,000 meters, from 200 to 2,000 meters, and be considered that twilight zone, where there's some light. So just another type of word or phrasing that we use to describe these different zones. And a lot of that depends on proximity to the benthic region and this, that, and the other. Or there's just a couple of swapping of terminology from euphotic zone to epipelagic. Within the mesopelagic zone, we find that steep change in the thermocline. There's going to be low energy and sluggish lifestyle. The bathypelagic is 2,000 to 4,000 meters. Abyssopelagic is going to be 4,000 to 6,000 meters and have a very low oxygen level, as well as be quite dark and cold. Next, we have just a brief touch here on estuaries, lagoons, and bays. And we have a separate talk for that in a separate presentation, so I won't go too far into this particular type of ecosystem until that talks, but do see estuaries and lagoons on our channel as well. So wetlands are going to consist of the combination of estuaries, lagoons, and bays. It's an ecosystem that is flooded by water, either permanently or seasonally, and it acts as a transition zone between the land and the sea. So again, more to follow regarding that, so check out that presentation. However, I will direct you to this summary table, and we can use this in order to, it's part of your activity for Bio 336, but you actually can use this as a means of being able to help you organize your thoughts regarding the differences between these different habitats. So for instance, in wetlands, lagoons, bays, and mangroves, we have these different characteristics that are going to be common across all these ecosystems, meaning they occur in each of those ecosystems. And you can use this presentation to kind of fill in the details regarding these other types of ecosystems. But in this first one, the exposure to waves, wind, waves and wind is going to be low. The substrate's going to be hydric soil, so it's going to be seasonally saturated by water. There's going to be peat and mud that occurs within these different wetlands. There's a mix of salt and fresh water. We call that brackish. And there's going to be a high level of nutrients in the water and sediment. And we've got a couple representative animals and plants. So just use this little sheet we have here to help you keep track of these different habitats as you go. Now the intertidal zone is one that we're probably quite familiar with because of the fact that we live in San Diego and there's quite a few of these available to us, and we seem to enjoy traveling there and checking out these different beautiful habitats. The zones within an intertidal zone are going to vary between the emersion and the immersion of those zones within a typical tidal flood. So at the very top here we have the spray zone, followed by the upper intertidal, the mid-intertidal, the low intertidal, and the subtidal, which is typically going to be continually covered by water. So even within the intertidal zone, you end up with the zonation that occurs, and you'll find there's quite a variety of animals and organisms that persist in those regions. It's defined by not only the substrate, whether that be a rocky substrate or bottom, a sandy one or a muddy one, but also this, what we call vertical zonation that is occurring within the intertidal zone, is going to have different assemblages. And there's really quite a bit of consistency. Unless there's a change in the resources available in those different vertical zones, then you find a lot of consistency in where those species are found. The substrates, as I mentioned, can consist of rock, which is granite, basalt, and a couple other sandstones, things like that. Boulders, there's going to be typically mobile organisms that occur within those regions that have substrates consisting of boulders because of the fact that there's so much movement from those boulders over time. So things like crabs can manage to live there, but you won't find sea stars and barnacles and all that living in the boulders because of the fact that they move too frequently, which means that their home would be moving, and that's not really conducive to a successful life for them. Pebbles are going to be easily movable substrate, so lots of times it's impossible for organisms to create a home there. So we find these rocks to be the most, diverse in terms of the organisms that are able to attach and find a way to withstand wave action as well as other elemental issues. The general patterns of zonation along the coast, as I mentioned, are going to be dominated by different species. We find in the upper intertidal, there's consistently periwinkles, which are these small little snails, as well as limpets and lichens. Oftentimes there'll be algae encrusted on those. Barnacles are going to be dominating in the mid-intertidal region, as well as mussels and seaweeds. So this tends to be the one where we, find ourselves in a lot, right? We're in the middle intertidal area, and there tends to be a little bit more action and interesting things there. And then in that lower intertidal region, it's mostly going to be seaweeds and surf grass that are going to be adhering to that rock substrate. The rocky shore characteristics tend to have steep coasts. There's going to be little sediment, and these rocky shores are going to be caused by uplift and erosion. Vertical zonation will also occur along these rocky shores, and we have something called the edge effect in these zones. Here, that basically means that there's a change in a population at a very kind of seemingly undefined boundary, although that boundary is defined by the tide. The limiting resource to these different regions are going to be space. As you can imagine in this picture, there's a limit to how many mussels you can fit and how many sea stars are able to attach to this different region. So that limiting resource is not necessarily food, but space. There's quite a bit of disturbance within these regions, as you can imagine. And because of that, there are predictions that are possible regarding the number of R and K selected species that can coexist within these intertidal regions. So the intermediate disturbance hypothesis evaluates the number of R and K selected species that can coexist by kind of comparing the number of disturbances as well as the frequency or the magnitude of those disturbances. So if there's, and for instance, in this on the left-hand side of this figure here, we have the level of disturbance. And on the left-hand side is where there's infrequent and small disturbances, which means you have a habitat that doesn't really have a lot of movement to it. There's not a whole lot that goes on in terms of, changes in the composition of nutrients and food or whatnot in that habitat. And in those regions, you find that competitive exclusion will limit the diversity. The fact that you have organisms that are kind of found within the same region and don't need to compete, don't have a large amount of diversity because of that whole competitive exclusion. Now, on the right-hand side of this figure, we have frequent and large disturbances that occur. And when that happens, when it gets to the furthest end of this particular scale, there's a high level of stress and there's high levels of or rates of extinction of organisms. However, there's kind of a niche spot here for these R and K selected species that occurs within these two different magnitude levels of disturbances. And when you find, or when there is a kind of moderate level of disturbance, the organisms or the species diversity, which goes from low to high on our y-axis here, is going to be quite high at that moderate level. And disturbances can include any kind of alterations to the environmental structure, biotic factors, things along those lines. So it's really changing the composition of a niche. And when there's too much of that disturbance, the niche becomes kind of untenable and something that organisms can't really find a way to occupy. For instance, when you remove sea stars, you affect the biodiversity in totality in these different regions. So in this particular figure, we have, along the x-axis here, we have a natural state located in the first panel. And in the second panel, we have a situation where sea stars are removed, either by something called the Great Sea Star Die-Off, which occurred in California a few years back, or the Pacific Northwest, or some other instance. And as those sea stars disappear, it becomes very easy for these mussels, who are not being consumed by the sea stars, to outcompete other species. So within the lower regions, within the lower region of this tidal area, so we've got low intertidal along the bottom, and then this dashed line is representing the designation between that and the middle intertidal zone. In the middle intertidal zone, prior to sea stars, plenty of mussels, but not all of the mussels. You take out those sea stars, which were dominating the lower intertidal, and you find that these mussels are going to outcompete other species and basically take over the entirety of that tidal region, so both the middle and the lower intertidal region. When there's nothing to really kind of compete for all these other resources or to consume them as well, then you run into this particular situation. So competitive exclusion is going to result in other species being kicked out of these different habitats, which obviously is leading to a huge lack of biodiversity. So intertidal organisms are very specialized. In a couple examples for you here, we have a buckshot barnacle. This is kind of a close-up of that organism with the underlying that another figure overlay with a kind of group of all these barnacles. They tend to live very close to one another. They're sessile in adulthood, meaning they don't move around when they're adults, but when they're spawning, they do have the ability to move when they're larvae. And here you can see there's a benefit to them being close to one another because they can actually reproduce easily and have genetic diversity for their species. This is actually a little, I forget what they call it in it. I guess it's equivalent to a penis there. But you've got some barnacle mating that's occurring within, because of the fact that these two are so close to one another. Periwinkles are going to be, as I mentioned, cute little snails that occur commonly in intertidal zones. We have line shore crabs, sea anemones are quite common. They're going to be closed above the water, and if you can check out in this picture, when they're closed, they attach a bunch of little seashells to their outside to help protect them from the waves and from things eating them. And then when they're underwater, they're going to expand their little tentacles there so that they can catch different organisms, different plankton for food. And then, of course, there's some of these other ones we're frequently used to seeing if you've spent any time in the intertidal zone, including sea stars, sea urchins, chitons, and various types of seagrass and seaweed. Adaptations are important for these organisms, and there are quite a few abiotic influences that are going to result in these highly adapted organisms, or these highly adapted kind of structures or whatnot for these organisms. So water loss or desiccation, which refers to drying out, is a big thing to be concerned about in a habitat where you're underwater half the time and then out of the water for half the time. Also, mechanical stress. There's going to be wave action hitting on those organisms. They have to withstand, for instance, the anemones place those little seashells on the outside of their body in order to help protect themselves. There's going to be issues with respect to respiration. If you're an organism that requires oxygenated water to get your oxygen, then being out of water for 6 hours at a time is problematic potentially. 12 hours at a time. Also, being able to feed properly, withstanding different salinity levels, and reproduction are all challenges that are going to be something that these organisms have found a way to deal with. For instance, this little periwinkle shell here has a muscular foot there, and in order to deal with desiccation or drying out, as well as protect itself, it has something called a perculum, which is kind of a calcified little structure. It's similar to your nail there, and it just covers the outside of this organism, the foot of this organism, so that it can protect itself. And then, of course, we mentioned anemones as well. So it just gives you an idea here, too, of some of the dynamics of the food web that occurs with these organisms. Seaweed, diatoms, and seagrasses are going to obtain their energy from the sun, so those are our primary producers that are going to be fed on by grazers such as limpets and snails and chitons, as well as sea urchins. And there's going to be some other seaweed that kind of floats in from other communities, such as the estuaries as well, that they'll feed on. The grazers are going to be, everything kind of turns into detritus eventually when it dies, but the grazers are largely going to be fed on by carnivores such as sea stars, snails, fish, crabs, and birds. And from there you have your different kind of secondary and tertiary kind of predators within the community. So we have a very kind of dynamic web here, and it's a very abundant area for finding food. Coral reefs are another region, sublittoral region, that we find some very unique habitats in, or that make up different unique habitats in the oceans. These are the most diverse marine habitats on Earth. However, they cover less than 1% of the ocean. They do, however, support greater than 25% of marine species, despite covering such a small region of the oceans. The largest living structure is a coral reef, the Great Barrier Reef, which is occurs in greater than 2,300 miles of coastline. That's obviously, probably changed since I wrote this fact. It's probably much less than that because there is damage that occurs to that Great Barrier Reef regularly due to changes in the ocean, as well as people going down and, obstructing those different structures. And there's a bit more about the Great Barrier Reef at that link. Characteristically, there are tropical coral reefs, which exist in warm waters that are typically about 21 degrees to 29 degrees Celsius, so 70-ish or so. So much warmer waters where there's ample sunlight and low turbidity, so there's not a lot of wave action occurring, and no real strong currents that are shifting organisms and larvae out of that region. There's going to be low nutrients that occur there, and these waters are typically saline. The reefs that occur within tropical reef regions are very old, between 5 and 10,000 years old. We also find cold water coral reefs. These occur in water as cold as 4 degrees Celsius and can be at a depth of anywhere between 40 meters and 2,000 meters. So they can, it's not what we typically think of with coral reefs. These are found in areas with an accelerated current along the continental shelf and also at seamounts. There's going to be low nutrient waters here as well as saline waters, and an example is the Norway Reef Complex, which is approximately 8,000 years old. So quite a bit of variety, as you can imagine. The map here on to the left-hand side indicates where we find those warm water reefs as well as cold water reefs in the northern and southern regions of the oceans. It's just another example of that over onto the right-hand side of the top map, and just an image of what those look like in the tropical regions, in the kind of deeper, a little bit colder regions, and then at the very deep seafloors. So there's no, although they don't persist entirely throughout the ocean, they are found in a variety of different latitudes. Coral reef organisms are going to be unique as well. So a little bit about corals first. Corals are relatives of jellyfish in a group called Cnidaria, and they can exist as individual polyps or in a large community. Most of the reef-building corals have a mutual benefit relationship with something called zooxanthellae, which is going to be an algae that can exist within the coral. And this really unique relationship is what allows for the transfer of organic material from the process of photosynthesis to the actual coral. So the algae is going to be something that exists only in these tropical regions, because obviously they photosynthesize and they can't do that in the deep waters. And that's what is responsible too for giving these corals such a bright kind of color to them as well. The zooxanthellae benefit because of the fact that they have a structure to protect them in, and they can also kind of have a space to adhere to as well. So 90% of the organic material from photosynthesis gets transferred to that coral polyp. It's kind of a really expensive rent, but it works for them. Hard coral or stony coral is a coral that produces calcium carbonate skeleton in the form of aragonite. Hard or stony coral is going to be another type of coral that produces a calcium carbonate skeleton in the form of aragonite. We also find that there's soft coral, which is where they do not produce a calcium carbonate skeleton, but they do have a spiny skeleton elements called sclerites, and they thrive in some of these nutrient-rich waters that has less light intensity. So we tend to find these in more of the deeper regions of the sea. However, the coral reefs, whether they be in tropical or deep colder water regions, are going to provide a home to a very diverse community of organisms. So these are just a few examples of organisms that can exist within mostly the tropical coral reefs, actually, for this particular figure. Coastal oceans can be broken into sublittoral zone and the sandy shore. The substrates are going to consist of sand and mud, typically most of the marine habitats are going to have sand or mud, and these little structures are going to be quite small and have finer particles to them. The substrates can also, however, consist of something called nifos, which is a dead zone of soft mud to ooze. This usually doesn't have any oxygen associated with it, and nothing lives in it. The substrates can also consist of rock particles and quartz and shell fragments, and it becomes kind of liquid when it's stirred or shaken, mostly because of the fact that it's just all these finer particles that have found their place together within that seafloor. The substrates in the sublittoral and sandy shore are unstable, which means there's no place for organisms to attach. So there's very few seaweeds, unless they can attach to a rock of some sort. And there's some seagrasses, however, those have a bit, there's very few seaweeds, but yeah, actually there's more prevalence of those seaweeds, grasses, because of the fact that they can attach to rocks and move around a bit more. The phytoplankton and diatoms are going to make up most of the primary producers in this region. Just to give you an idea of how the size of grain is an important factor that affects bottom communities. So we have over on the left-hand side here this gravel size in millimeters, and then we move to sand, silt, and clay. And the composition of the sediment is going to directly relate to the amount of water that can move through those sediments. So within the well-sorted or coarse kind of structures, you have a lot more water movement than you do within these well-sorted or fine grains, as well as poorly sorted or a combination of water structures that are going to block water. So a general rule is that fine sediment remains suspended with water motion, whereas the coarse sediment settles out. So as you can imagine, this can impact the organisms that live within that sediment. The sandy and muddy shore is going to have a bit of variety in terms of the abiotic characteristics that are going to describe them, mostly because there's going to be a higher level of wave energy in the sandy shores. The grain size is going to be coarser, the water content is going to be lower and less organic matter, and there'll be a higher level of oxygen as compared to those muddy shores. So you can differentiate between those different ecosystems, and some of these other factors, abiotic factors, really do have an impact on the different, and make those different ecosystems. Finally, we have vertical zonation of oxygen within the sediments. You can determine that by taking a sediment core and looking at regions that have something called a black layer, which is where oxygen is going to be depleted, and hydrogen sulfide is produced by anaerobic bacteria. So the color of that sediment is going to give you clues as to what the oxygenation level is as well. Now there's several organisms that can successfully live within these habitats, as you can imagine. Within the sandy shore, there's, again, general patterns of zonation in that sandy shore. And that is going to host a variety of different organisms in the different vertical sections of the sandy shore. The sandy bottom dwellers are going to consist of organisms such as sand crabs, roly-polies and razor clams, and bloodworms. These are going to be burrowing creatures that can prevent their burrow from caving in by cementing the inside with some form of slime or other excrement. The bloodworms are going to be mid-intertidal and near the surface, and they eat sand as they burrow. So a lot of different adaptations for dealing with these kind of mobile sediments along the floor. Leopard sharks are another organism that tend to feed on some of the larger prey that exists within these sandy bottoms. Off to the left-hand side, you see an example of leopard sharks in La Jolla. If you haven't been out there at all, it's a really, I think in the springtime, probably spring, it's a really interesting thing to do, and they're gentle sharks, so it's kind of cool to go out there and snorkel, and you can actually try and touch them. Don't like grab them and take them home, but you know. And then off to the right-hand side, we also find organisms such as the California halibut, as well as other fish that are going to bury within that sediment and use that as a means of camouflage. So organisms have found different ways to deal with and manage to survive in these sandy bottoms. The sublittoral organisms are going to, a couple of examples of that, include the stargazer or the blenny, which can sink into the sand by blowing water around its body and kind of wriggling from side to side. The Pacific leaping blenny, and there's a cool little YouTube video there if you like to take a look, and then a tidewater goby, which was listed as on the endangered list in 1994. So we find all of these sublittoral organisms in the sandy bottom despite the fact that it can be so challenging to survive. And then finally, we can kind of categorize and group organisms based on where they exist within the sediment. So epifauna live on the substrate, on top of the substrate, such as sea stars and barnacles. Infauna live in that sediment, and myofauna, are going to live in the interstitial space in the sediment. So a lot of times this will consist of larvae, marine worms, things like that, wherein it doesn't matter so much because they're so small. It doesn't matter much if there's little sediment bits that are particles that are surrounding them. Okay, and I hope that gave you a good overview, intro to marine ecosystems.